My name is Ashley Worth. I am a student in the Action Research class in the Masters of Arts in Teaching online program at San Diego State, and this is my Action Research project about literary support in the high school classroom. A table of contents guides the beginning of this slide deck that goes through the processes, including an introduction, the method and action plan, the results, and finally a discussion. To begin with a statement of the problem, administrators like to remind us that English is the most failed subject in the Grossmont Union High School District. A lot of that is because students are required to pass 8 semesters of English, which is more than most other subjects, including math, science, and world languages. And they have to pass that with a D or higher for high school graduation and with a C or higher to be A through G compliant and eligible for college admission. The problem, though, is that students seem to be entering high school with lower and lower literacy levels, and so naturally they become very limited in their performance and in their proficiency in class. So it's pretty clear that supports are needed in 2 major areas, in that of reading and writing. So when thinking about that, I decided that a research question for me that I could implement in a high school English classroom would be, how will the incorporation and promotion of audiobook files support students' reading performance as measured by chapter quizzes? I believe that adding audiobook supports to one of my English classes would result in higher average scores on chapter quizzes than those classes which did not get that support. So that was my hypothesis, the null hypothesis being that the incorporation of those supports would not result in higher average scores compared to my other classes that didn't receive the treatment. I began by reviewing the literature, which included points that audiobooks foster reading comprehension, fluency, language acquisition, vocabulary development, and improved achievement. It was pretty well supported that students who listened to audiobooks began enjoying the process of reading and the idea of hearing stories. And so just that positive experience would foster more and more future reading and maintain that to be a positive, steady habit. Additionally, the use of audiobooks to model fluency seems like a really present argument that is made, that when you listen to audiobooks, you have the perfect examples, maybe not perfect, but very strong examples of pronunciation, enunciation, flow, and speed and pacing. And so students are not only getting the support of this guide that keeps them moving through the curriculum, but also how it should sound, how their own reading should sound. Oh, before I move on, it also helps with stamina, which I think is really important because students frequently become fatigued, they would say. After a few pages, it seems like, oh my gosh, I have to read this much. But with the support of an audiobook, it tends to keep the pace moving and they don't feel as overwhelmed. Ultimately, audiobooks are nothing new. There's a long history with some strong validity about just the concept of assisted reading. And a lot of that comes down to the idea that audiobooks allow students to continue moving forward in their zone of proximal development. So essentially, they can read and access texts that are just perhaps beyond their current ability levels, but because of that modeled fluency, they are able to better understand and comprehend and pick up the messages of that particular text, pushing their reading abilities forward. So in my research, I have 2 groups, an experiment group and a control group. My experiment group, which is receiving the treatment of audiobooks, is made up of 33 sophomores, 20 of which are female, 13 are male. But this class is a little tricky to analyze data from because it also includes 12 students on IEPs. So for that reason, later I'll show, I broke down all students versus gen ed students only, just to have a more equitable comparison for the data. In my control group that did not receive the audiobook treatment, that's made up of 38 sophomores, so of course same grade level, same course, college prep, sophomore English. This class has more males, 20 males, 18 females, and 0 students on IEPs. So the instruments that I used look something like this. 4 different chapter quizzes, 30 questions each. So because they were the same point value and question number, it was pretty easy to compare the results, and those were taken every 3 chapters as we were reading Lord of the Flies. Those scores were saved in an Excel spreadsheet, a snapshot of which is here. I ended up generating way too much information as I was trying to figure out all of the things that I did and didn't need. But you can kind of see, even at a glance zoomed out like this, you might be able to tell pink and blue in here as I'm tracking male versus female, as well as some highlighted yellow, which was separating out my special ed students. So trying to get big pictures as well as smaller pictures about what was going on with the different populations. The research design was a non-equivalent control group design. The 2 groups throughout the unit both had 4 quizzes administered to them, and the control group had independent reading both in class and at home, while the experiment group included in-class and at-home access to audiobooks. There were a few internal threats to validity, including selection bias. So of course, as we've said, the experiment group had the 12 students on IEPs. There's also, under the label of history, which to my understanding is just kind of, here are all the things that your students could be going through that could then affect the results. We had state and district testing going on. We had spring break inching closer and closer, which of course had an effect on students' work ethic and stamina and behavior, and any of their own personal ups and downs that they might have been going through. There's also the threat just of the testing process itself. Because all of the quizzes were very similar, the argument could be made that they learned the format and the expectations on the quizzes and got better over time. So as it's kind of been shown, the procedure of this was that we would read in class while the audiobook was playing in the experiment group. They also had the links present on Google Classroom so that they could get additional support, whether it was rereading or if they were absent that day or anything like that. And that data was collected over the course of about 2 weeks as we worked our way through this book. So what did that data show? Well, it kind of showed a little bit of this and a little bit of that all made me feel like it showed nothing. Sometimes it supported the alternate hypothesis, sometimes it seemed to support the null hypothesis. So I broke it down by a couple of things, attempting to understand. I broke it down by a comparison of median scores, of mean scores. I included the standard deviations, and I ran a t-test. I ran a t-test based on the data that's included in Figure 2, which I'll show in a moment, and the results were that p equals 0.785. From my understanding, that would mean that these results are statistically significant. I will add a little asterisk that, to be very honest, and I hope I'm not shooting myself in the foot here, I don't know if I did that correctly, because that seems higher than what I would have thought. But I found that number and I confirmed that number because I used both the Excel tool pack as well as the online GraphPad calculator. So unless I was using the wrong data, I think that's correct. I hope that's correct. I don't know. That said, though, it's important that we focus on the practical significance for action research in our classes. And because the results were so close, they are not practically significant in this study. And there are a number of factors why these things could have been different, which were partially mentioned in the threats to validity, and I'll touch on again in the discussion as well. So a couple of charts. These are the median scores. What number was in the middle? The scores were out of 30, and the blue Series 1 is my experiment group. The orange Series 2 is my control group. And this chart here compares all students. But remember that that blue experiment group had 12 students on AAPs. So for that reason, I also pulled just gen ed students only because that might be a more accurate or fair comparison here. And in 3 out of 4 cases, the scores are higher. But over here, if we start with figure 2 and go out of order, here are my 4 quizzes. The average score, the mean score for my experiment and for my control group, they are not higher 3 out of 4 times. Sometimes the experiment group did better. Sometimes the control group did better. And then up here, I also broke it down just in case to see, I took the average quiz score overall. So instead of by 4 different assessments, I combined them and ran just one average out of 30 points. And the experiment group, again, higher, but just barely higher than the control group. Broken down by male and female, though it didn't tend show a huge big swing there at all. So as I think about that, okay, I'm getting these mixed results. I'm not really seeing a huge practical significance. What would I do next time? There are a few things that I would like to do in future research. I would first edit the assessments that I used because those assessments included things like literary devices and elements. And those questions have nothing to do with the support that an intervention like an audiobook would provide. An audiobook is not going to allow a student to better recognize a metaphor in a quoted example. So I would eliminate those so that it's just based on simple reading comprehension so I could get a clearer picture. I would also eliminate absent student records so that my data would have more fidelity. So in this case, absent students were recorded with a 0, which would of course bring down my data points. And there were quite a few absences. Like I said, this was before spring break. There were a number of kids going on vacation and things like that. So because I copied over my grade book, and in my grade book, an absent student would get a 0 until they made it up, I just kept that data for this research. But I think next time I would eliminate that. I would also be interested in comparing the same students with a treatment versus without a treatment instead of comparing my 2 different groups because I'm just very curious. I think that that would probably show more accurate and interesting results than comparing 2 different groups because we all know that classes can just be very different by nature. And as difficult as this would be as a high school teacher with upwards of 150 students, I would really like the opportunity to compare data on individuals as opposed to whole class. In particular, students that I think are struggling with their reading comprehension and seeing how I could target just those individuals, which we're supposed to always be doing, but it becomes really, really difficult to do on a one-on-one basis. To wrap up, I'd like to show my references that were used for the literature review. And I would like to simply say thank you.